Good evening, folks. We have reached the bottom of the hour, which means it's time to begin. The food chain is a fundamental concept in science, nature, and environmental education. So fundamental, in fact, that it can be a challenge to keep fresh. Emily M. Stone has wholly embraced this challenge, and we will find out how during this evening's Green Teacher webinar. Tonight's webinar will be 1 hour in total. That's a 30-minute presentation followed by a 30-minute question and answer period. All will be recorded. If you have any questions or comments throughout, please type them into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. I will answer as many as I can throughout. All others will be addressed during the Q&A. At the end of the presentation, we will ask everyone to fill out a 2-minute survey. Those who do will be eligible for one of 2 free subscriptions to Green Teacher magazine. Green Teacher is a quarterly magazine that shares innovative articles, activities, and lesson plans from passionate educators both in and outside K-12 classrooms across North America and overseas. For the past dozen or so years, we have also published several books. We invite you to subscribe or purchase a book, as this will allow us to continue offering our selection of free webinars. So too does the assistance of our webinar partners, both in Canada and in the United States. Our presenter this evening is Emily M. Stone. She's a naturalist who spent her childhood as a quote-unquote mud and water daughter in Northeast Iowa. She has taught students of all ages about nature in beautiful places from Maine to California. As the current Naturalist Education Director at the Cable Natural History Museum in Cable, Wisconsin, Emily writes a weekly Natural Connections column for more than a dozen local and regional newspapers. She has also released her first book, Natural Connections, Exploring Northwoods Nature Through Science and Your Senses. This evening, Emily will take us inside her teaching process, specifically with regards to using progressive skits to teach food chains. Emily?
Okay, there we go. One more slide. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. I'm very excited to share with you the fun progressive skit process that I use to teach food chains with lots of different students. As Ian said, I work at the Cable Natural History Museum, and I am the Naturalist and Education Director. I've been there for 8 years. We are located in the middle of nowhere in northern Wisconsin, surrounded by beautiful national forests and lakes and near Lake Superior. And where are you from? Where did you tune in tonight? Go ahead and tell us in the chat box. I get outside a lot, so this is me last week leading some 3rd graders on a snowshoe hike, learning about the winter adaptations of mammals. As Ian said, I also have published a book, a compilation of my weekly newspaper columns called Natural Connections, Exploring Northwoods Nature Through Science and Your Senses. And coming out very soon on the Ides of March, I will have my 2nd book, which is also a compilation of my newer newspaper columns, Natural Connections, Dreaming of an Elfin Skimmer. Those are available to purchase on the Cable Natural History Museum's website, cablemuseum.org. So as part of my job as the Naturalist and Education Director, I go into classrooms several times a year with tubs of dead stuff, furs and skulls and replica scat and all sorts of fun things to teach our museum mobile program. I also lead spring field trips at the museum. It's generally 1st and 2nd graders coming to learn about the topic of our annual exhibit, because we build our own exhibits new each year, and our field trips are based off that topic. We also host many Wisconsin Master Naturalist volunteer trainings, both the full course of 40 hours of lessons and also advanced trainings to help people learn more. Overall, we have over 200 public programs every year, which if you come from a big city, that doesn't sound like much, but in a town of 800 people in the middle of the woods, that's quite a lot. So to begin with tonight, I have 2 videos to show you the final product, a possible goal to aim for as you teach your progressive skits. The first example is some adorable first and second graders, and the second example is some equally adorable master naturalists. Sit back and enjoy. Hey, decomposers. All right, nice job. Take a bow, everybody.
Camera, action. Rise and shine. Oh, no. Oh, I'm so old.
So I'm not sure you could tell, but I think the adults had as much, if not more fun than the children putting on those skits. So maybe it's obvious after that, maybe it's not. Why would you want to use teacher-led progressive skits? They're quick. They can take anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, and a lot of that time is determined by how much you talk as the teacher. They're fun and engaging, as you can see from the videos. They really make food chains come alive. They create emotional connections. I have been impressed by how connected the students get to the part they play in the skit. I taught some college students using this skit, some outdoor education majors, and when they sent me a thank you note, they actually signed it with their skit character in addition to their name. So they really drew a connection to what they played. You control the level of information that the students get. It can be tailored to any age or a mix of ages. The simplified lines eliminate ums and ahs, which I don't know about you, but that's one of my least favorite things about doing or watching student plays. And students can let their personality shine through, hopefully without being disruptive. So in order to tailor it to your audience, with kindergartners, you can keep it simple to the vocabulary they know and the creatures that they're familiar with. With elementary and middle school students, it is a great opportunity to introduce and review important vocabulary. With mixed age groups, you can include the vocabulary appropriate for the oldest students, and you can include simple explanations so that everybody understands what's going on. And with adults, you can introduce higher level concepts such as energy flow, the trophic pyramid, and details about your own local ecosystem. Finally, for pre-service educators, you can just teach the variety. So here's an example of the food chain that I most commonly teach in my skit. But if you wanted to get more complex, you could also do something like this trophic pyramid that has a lot more steps and a lot more energy flow shown. So some more options for customizing your skit. You can use the same vocabulary that I tend toward, which is plants, herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, scavengers, and decomposers. You could also use the producer, consumer, decomposer vocabulary. or you could stick with just predator and prey. So you can also customize it by what type of food chain you want to illustrate. The skit we just saw, the first one, was a local aquatic food chain, and we based that off our Lakes Alive exhibit from a few years ago. You also saw the adult skit with the local terrestrial food chain. I first learned this type of skit while I was working in the redwoods of California, and we did a redwood skit at the beginning of every field day in the redwood forest. Tide pools are really fun. The desert, the tundra, etc. Anything. You can make a food chain about your backyard. You could also make a food chain with whatever you have laying around. This is what I pulled out of the puppet bin in our kids area and said, oh, this would make a food chain we could teach about. When can you use the skit? At the start of a field trip. Right now, this is my favorite time to use the progressive skit. It makes a really great introduction. You could also use it to introduce a theme or a unit in your classroom. You could use it to apply learning at the end of a unit about a particular ecosystem, or whenever you want to have some fun. It's a pretty high energy and allows some goofiness techniques, so it can liven up a day in the classroom. So in order to prepare to lead your skit, you want to think about the concepts and the vocabulary that you want to teach, and you should use your local science standards for guidance. You can research the ecosystem you want to highlight, or not. You actually don't have to get very complex with this. It can be the obvious if you want. Decide which organisms to use. Or if you like to decide, you can let the student decide as you either a prop for each organism or not. Sometimes it's just actions that the students do, or you could prepare enough ahead of time that the students actually make their own props. So this is a list of the characters and the props from my Lakes Alive skit. So for the sun, I always have on hand this beautiful flowy piece of yellow fabric. The algae is my favorite. This is a hubcap that we found in our yard after the snow melted, and we had a local artist paint it in splotches of green to use to be our algae. We also have an aquatic snail, which is a hat with feelers. We did discover that when you're using a prop with multiple schools, you have to worry about lice. So I don't recommend headgear as props. The dragonfly nymph was a headband with antenna. The bluegill was a beautiful stuffed fish that we received as a donation from a museum member. The great blue heron is kitchen tongs. And the crayfish is a lobster floaty toy. The aquatic worms were represented by the lead worm who wore a brown scarf, and all the other worms just wiggled around. So you can see it's a pretty low-key set of props that you need, and you can get as fancy or as non-fancy as you like. The setup is that you begin with all students in the audience, whether that's in desks or on the floor. You have your props handy but out of sight. I find that it gets distracting if your props are visible. You'll tell students that they'll be putting on a skit for each other. Usually there's a little murmur of excitement that rumbles through the crowd. And remind them of how a good audience behaves. And then you ask for your first volunteer. This is my favorite part because I get to say, I need a star of the show. And the hands go up, you can see you need somebody bright and shining with lots of energy, and they will provide almost all the energy for life on Earth. So I usually have the students guess what that actress or actor will represent, and then we choose a volunteer, often wearing a yellow t-shirt if I can find one. And once I have my volunteer up and give them the yellow cape, I teach them their lines. So we crouch down to start with, like it's night. Then they'll stand up and fling their arms and say, rise and shine, with lots of energy. And then I practice that with them. And then I say lights, camera, action, and away they go. So I do the lights, camera, action motion like you would with a clapboard in the movies. So with each new scene, you will review the previous steps in the food chain, talk about the next organism and its place in the food chain, write a vocabulary word on the whiteboard, and you can progressively create the typical circular food chain diagram by doing that. And then you'll choose a volunteer, or you can choose. If you want to do that sooner, you can do that too. And then you'll practice their line and their action. Say, to your places, everyone, which sends the sun back to crouching down, the algae back to crouching down, other characters off stage. And then lights, camera, action, away you go. And at the very end, or actually, after every scene, I have the whole audience clap for a job well done. So after the sun, we move on to plants who are taking that energy and turning it into sugar. So the plant in this skit was an algae. So I had the algae crouched down. Once the sun rises, then the algae starts growing. And the algae and the whole audience chants photosynthesis 3 times. I often have everyone help the algae with this because photosynthesis is such a tongue twister. So once the plants have stored the sugar that they use the sun's energy to create, then herbivores come along and want to steal that sugar. So our herbivore for this skit was a snail. They're going to start off stage, which is just somewhere off to the side. After the algae grows, the snail will slither in and pretend to scrape the algae with their tongue, also known as a radula, if you want to get technical. And they will say, munch, munch, munch. Munch, munch, munch. So the sun shines down, the plants use its energy to store sugar, herbivores come along to steal that sugar, and then omnivores come along to steal the energy from the herbivores. So our omnivore in this skit was a dragonfly nymph. They will start off stage. Once the snail eats, the dragonfly nymph swims in with arms tucked under their chin like a hydraulic powered mouth part. If you've never seen them eat, you should Google it on YouTube because they shoot their lower jaw out and capture prey. And they will pretend to chomp on the snail and say, gotcha. We had 2 omnivores in this food chain skit because we like them so much. The bluegill is another omnivore. So they also start off stage. Once the dragonfly nymph eats, the fish swims in. They pretend to chomp on the dragonfly nymph and say, yum. So moving on to carnivores who are going to come along and want to steal the energy from the omnivores. We have the great blue heron. They'll start off stage. The bluegill continues swimming right past the heron after it eats, and the heron darts out to grab the fish. They say, gotcha. And then the heron crumples to the ground, dead of old age. So especially with dealing with younger children, I've struggled with how to kill my carnivore. They need to die somehow, and I want to do it in a less traumatic way if possible. So oftentimes I just have my carnivore die of old age. I'm not sure you heard it in the adult skit example at the beginning, but the wolf, after having its last meal, said, oh, I'm so old, and rolled over and died. Roadkill is another somewhat appropriate one, and the kid can be the car and the driver. Or you could pick an ecologically relevant cause, a lead-poisoned eagle, a hunted wolf, or a bat with white nose syndrome. Or something funny, maybe the zombie apocalypse comes. Take your pick. So our line is growing longer of all the actors and actresses in the skit. And we move on after carnivores to scavengers. So the carnivore's dead, but they still have energy left in their body. So the scavengers are going to come and try and get some. So we have the crayfish. They will start off stage. Once the heron dies, the crayfish crawls out and begins eating the heron. And they say, dead stuff, which is one of the lines of the skit that most laughs from the audience. So then we move on to decomposers. And I usually take a minute here to explain the difference to the students because it's not always obvious. So scavengers are similar to carnivores or herbivores, but decomposers are mostly invertebrates. Scavengers are eating big chunks of dead stuff, while decomposers are eating little pieces of dead stuff. Scavengers poop out regular poop that still needs to be broken down more, and decomposers poop out soil. They break things back down into their nutrients. And, you know, of course, poop is a wonderful thing to talk about with elementary students. Some examples of scavengers are crows, coyotes, and raccoons. Examples of decomposers are invertebrates, bacteria, fungus, and fire. So our decomposers in the lake skit are aquatic worms, which are actually way more common than you would ever expect down there in the mud at the bottom of the lake. So they can begin in the front row of the audience. They don't have to come up to stage to begin with. Sometimes it's everyone who's left. If I have a small group for field trips, I just have the last, 7 kids wiggle forward as the decomposers. And once the crayfish begins eating, they can wiggle forward and join the crayfish in eating the dead predator. And their chance is decomposition, decomposition, decomposition. I also enjoy asking the students who needs the soil that decomposers poop out. Sometimes they look at the circle and don't think hard enough and say it goes back to the sun. But of course, we know that the soil goes to the plants and that decomposers can't actually give anything back to the sun because it's too far away. So we usually take a moment to say thank you to the sun at that point as well. So some variations you could do. You could decide on the characters ahead of time. You could create the cast of characters as you go. Students could create their own masks or costumes. As a follow-up assignment, you can have the students draw the skit characters or write out the storyline in their own words. Or you could act out a life cycle. It doesn't have to be a food chain. You could do the butterfly life cycle, including the migration of monarchs, or you could do frogs. You can also use these skits to illustrate seasonal changes, also known as phenology. And I've done this when we had an exhibit called Nature's Calendar. We actually used the example of a frog, an ermine, and a hummingbird, and we took them through spring, summer, fall, and winter, and all the different activities those animals were doing in different seasons. Or anything else. You don't have to stick exactly to the procedure I've put out. You don't have to stick to food chains, but this type of skit where you're feeding students lines little by little works for a lot of different things to help make things move smoothly and to give you enough chance to work in teaching as you go with the skit. Are there any questions?
So at this moment, I'll jump back in, and we're only halfway through, and this is your opportunity to now come up with questions that you would like to put directly to Emily. Again, I invite everyone to put your questions just in the chat box. I can manage those and ensure that those go on a first come, first served basis. So if any questions do come up, please do add them to the chat box. I do have one to begin with, is more of a logistical consideration of dealing with particularly shy students. And Emily, can you speak to any strategies that you've successfully used to engage students who are just much more shy than the rest of the students in a group?
Absolutely. First, I don't choose them to be the sun. The sun generally needs to be somebody who's willing to speak out loud. But beyond that, many of the parts don't actually have to have any sort of speaking part at all. The snail could very easily scrape the algae with its radula and not speak. And so if you give those shy students a prop that they can hide behind and a character where they don't actually have to speak if they don't want to, it generally works out pretty well. Another character that you could assign to a shy student is one of the group characters. So they could be a decomposer with a whole group of decomposers at the end, so they wouldn't have to be on stage all alone.
Excellent. We've got lots of questions coming in here. The next one is, could the students create the skit from the beginning? So for example, maybe this would be more suitable for a longer time period than you would have on a field trip.
Absolutely, you can run it any way you like. You know, I'm an informal educator and I have very small snippets of time with kids usually, so I never have the luxury to engage the kids in more planning. But I could see it being very effective to have the students start from the beginning, thinking about what characters they'd want to include in the food chain, deciding who in their classroom would be good at which part, and creating the costumes all from scratch.
Okay, the next one coming in is, do you have any tips, Emily, for keeping a larger group of, say, 20 or more students engaged?
It requires some redirecting. I think I have a pretty high tolerance for excited kids on field trips, and so I just expect a little bit of chatter and a little bit of talking out of turn and you know, too enthusiastic clapping at the end and that kind of stuff. But prefacing it with being a good audience, starting out with those expectations can help you bring it back to students at the end. And if you allow, you know, 30 seconds of being crazy or clapping too loud or giggling, and then bring it back in, usually students will become engaged once the skit gets moving.
Great, and a follow-up to that is, have you had any challenges engaging students who have been assigned a role, but they're just waiting for their part in the show, so to speak?
Yeah, sometimes kids get wandery up front or start poking their neighbor. But I usually just say that if they can't keep their hands to themselves or pay attention, then I'll pick somebody else for the part. And generally in the context of my field trips, that works for kids, then they really want to behave so that they don't lose the privilege of being in the skit.
Sure, and if you've, another follow-up to that, if you have a student who isn't necessarily misbehaving, but is perhaps energetic to the point of being distracting, do you have any practical tips for handling that sort of student?
I generally try and redirect their energy towards something that makes sense with the skit. You know, if I can have them do something that is related to their character that uses a lot of energy but isn't too distracting, or at least isn't noisy, then that is a good way to sort of channel their energy. And also just gentle reminders.
For sure, giving a task to those with busy minds and or busy hands can certainly be an effective strategy. Lots more coming in here. Do the students know the skits, the storyline of the skit from the beginning? And then the follow-up to that is, how well do they retain the vocabulary?
The students that I teach don't know the storyline from the beginning. It's usually, you know, a very general introduction that it's a food chain. And I don't even really go over what a food chain is necessarily. It depends on the group and the context. And I know that there is some retention. I don't have a great system in place for evaluation, but we say the words over and over, and oftentimes this isn't the first time that the students have heard the words. So I believe that there is pretty good retention. I also see a lot of these students throughout the school year in the museum mobile program. So we'll use the skit often when they come at the end of second grade to our field trip, and then I see them again in the classroom in third grade. And we talk about food chains right away in third grade, and I usually don't have any trouble at all getting kids to raise their hands and contribute ideas toward all the different links in the food chain.
Great, and another question, and I'll add a follow-up to this. What is the reaction from teachers? And then the follow-up I'll add is, what is the reaction from any other guardians, parents, etc.?
They generally love it. you know, there's lots of smartphones that get pulled out and pictures are being taken and videos are being taken. So there's a lot of entertainment value in it. I guess the teachers in their evaluations of our field trips tend to say that the kids continued talking about it on the bus home, and that it was part of the chatter and part of things, something that the students remembered and enjoyed.
Great, and we've got a suggestion here coming to us all the way from the Maritimes out east, where they have lots of snow. Have you ever considered building into a food chain activity a threat? And this takes me right back to playing the survival game as a kid. And if so, how have you done so, and what was the effect of that?
I've never, besides having a car and driver hit my crow or a hunter kill my wolf, I've never built a threat in like a game. I've done that with many other activities, but this skit, the way I use it, it is, you know, I'm trying to fit it into about 20 minutes, and I don't have a lot of extra time to bring in additional craziness, and so I haven't. I could see opportunities for doing that, and I'd be excited to know if you do incorporate that in the future.
And I'm sure many of us have had some exposure or have in fact played or organized the survival game, and that, I don't know if it's officially trademarked, but it effectively is just known as the survival game, and
right.
It's about energy flow through a food chain and an ecosystem. And I know a core component of that is a threat in some form, whether it's a fungal blight, invasive species. I mean, there's so many options to choose from.
There are. And I was just rereading that question too, and it made me realize it wasn't just like a predator threat they were meaning, but like pollution or some other environmental hazard. And because I generally use this with pretty young kids, I generally don't talk too much about the bummers. But if you were using it with older kids, I could see much more opportunity for incorporating the environmental threats into your food chain.
Yeah, the two videos we saw certainly show an indoor setting, but another question about doing this outside on a tour of the grounds.
Absolutely, yep. I've done it outside many times too. Pretty much any setting works as long as you have a comfortable place for the audience to sit and a safe place for the characters, the actors and actresses to stand. You're good to go.
For sure. And then I knew this question would come up. It always does with this topic is, what about the older students, you know, getting into middle school when they're starting to worry about looking cool and looking silly in front of their peers? How would you manage those situations?
You know, I haven't done this with older students in a long time, but when I did it in the Redwoods, it was mostly 5th and 6th graders. And there was definitely some giggling in the audience, but mostly students were really excited to be up there and be in front of their peers and be part of this skit. So I'm not sure that I'm the person to answer that question the best. I feel like a lot of you out there probably have more experience managing that type of stuff. I really just like working with the age groups that get awkward like that. I stick to the younger ones that still just have fun.
Well, for sure, certainly extra challenges come once they turn 10, 11, 12. Just a quick note has come in, and a thank you to Judy, who I will quote, says, "I know who invented the survival game, and I worked with him. His name is Frank Glew, that's Glew, who worked for the Kitchener-Waterloo School Board in Ontario." So thank you, Judy, for that anecdote. And if you see Frank, tell him thank you on behalf of many, young and old, and young at heart. So going back up the list here, measuring learning outcomes and retention, so the longer game, so to speak. Are you able to track students after they leave and track behavior? Any built-in mechanism for that?
We don't, and that's something that at the museum we keep talking about wanting more of, is evaluation. So the best I can tell you is that when I go back into their classroom, in the winter for Museum Mobile, students are excited to see me, and they often remember quite a bit of the vocabulary and are just excited to learn about nature. So all I have is anecdotal evidence.
Sure, and it's certainly a starting point. And if anybody else has any ideas to add to any of these discussion points, by all means, feel free to add these to the chat. We will, tomorrow, when we send a follow-up email to all the participants, we will include the link to the recording of this evening's webinar and Q&A, as well as some of the more pertinent ideas in the chat board as well, and also any resources if people have questions about further reading, further websites to go to, we will include that as well. But we have more questions coming in here.
I see, I'll jump in here for a second. I see
Sure.
Jody commented that she uses a similar technique to teach trees and their functions, and I think I've probably done the same thing. There's an activity called Build a Tree by Joseph Cornell in Sharing the Joy of Nature, or one of his other books. And it's a very similar activity where you bring in, one part of the tree at a time and give them an action and a sound. And have them act out the parts of the tree. We do that with second graders in the classroom, and it's another very effective form of this type of activity.
Great, and another comment coming in from Sherry about incorporating communications into the skit, such as each level in the food chain interviewing the one before them. That's a great idea for getting them talking and building that into a lesson where one of the core outcomes is communication. And is that something, Emily, that you have used or could see?
No, it's a fun idea. As an informal educator, like I said, my snippets are so short with them, I don't get to follow up with some of the more in-depth ideas, but that sounds awesome.
Next question about adding more complexity to the food web, and this could mean many different things. I know one broader aspect of this is the tie-in to biodiversity, and I know one of the barriers with that at times is steering learners away from the perception that biodiversity is just about creatures eating other creatures, when in fact that's one of the components, but there are other species interdependencies. I mean, woodpecker holes that are reused by flying squirrels, for example. Old termite mounds being reused by other insects. So have you included any of those more complex items in any of these activities?
A little bit, yeah. We did, one of our exhibits was called Better Together, Celebrating a Natural Community, and we focused on all types of symbiotic relationships and just other partnerships in nature. And so our skit was about a beaver who was traveling around trying to find a place to build a dam and a pond, and the beaver was gathering a whole slew of creatures who also needed a pond to live in. And so that talked not about eating, but about all having a place to live. So we had the great blue heron and the fish and the frog and the water lily, and we probably used that lobster floaty toy again too. So that's another way to do it. It doesn't have to be about eating each other. And with older students, I definitely talk and have different lessons that are focused on symbiotic relationships and that sort of thing. And we do, in third grade, we do a food web activity, not quite a skit, but we do the Who Am I activity, where you get a picture on your back and then basically play 20 questions with your classmates to figure out who's on your back, what critter you are. And then once everybody has guessed their critter, which includes plants and some abiotic components of the ecosystem, then we connect everything with string in a little food web. We have all the students sit in a circle and talk about who's connected to who through what ways. So that's a kind of a different activity to do a food web. And I could see a version of this skit where you get your whole class involved as different members of an ecosystem and have them somehow relate to each other in the skit, and also connect by string at the end if you wanted that visual of a web.
Yeah, and that idea of connecting by string and getting them communicating, it would seem that there'd be a natural natural use for that with concepts such as the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the rock cycle, etc. Are those cycles that have found their way into your work?
They haven't, only because they aren't topics that generally come up in our field trips, but man, that would be really fun to have a rock cycle skit. Yeah, that would be great. I wish we taught more geology.
Yeah, making rocks fun without using bad puns like rocks rock, which I've seen too many times to count, but making rocks fun, I can certainly relate to the challenge of that. Like, it's 1 billion years old, but nobody knows what that even means.
Yeah, I once tried to learn how to juggle when I was trying to teach the rock cycle. So I had 2 colors of Play-Doh, and we made sedimentary rocks, and then we smushed them into metamorphic rocks with the layers of Play-Doh, and then completely smushed them into igneous rocks. And I ended up with 3 balls of 3 different types of rocks, and the goal was to put the rock cycle in motion. Unfortunately, I never figured out how to juggle, so I could never quite do that.
Yes, I tried when I was about 9 and I've had limited success. Here's another broader question of, I know in my experience in doing this type of programming, I've come across, very seldom, but I've come across some people who are really averse to any sort of anthropomorphizing. And personally, I don't see a huge detriment to using that in the practice, especially with really younger grades. But have you ever had someone bring that to your attention to say, wow, that you're getting a great blue heron to say munch, 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 and they don't do that? And has that ever been a talking point?
Not in this context, no. In other higher level, more senior grades and stuff, we've talked about that occasionally. And we also have 2 live education raptors, a red-tailed hawk and an American kestrel, at the museum. So we're very careful not to anthropomorphose them. But in this context, nope, no one has ever cared that we make the characters a little bit goofy and have them talk.
Yeah, and that's certainly been my experience. And as they say in, well, many contexts, context is everything. Are there any additional questions out there? We've still got quite a few people lined up here. We've worked through the questions that we currently have, and we do have a few minutes left. If you do have additional questions, please go ahead with those. In the meantime, I will invite everyone to take just 1.5 or 2 minutes to fill out a short survey. As I mentioned in the introduction, anyone who does will be eligible for one of 2 free subscriptions to Green Teacher magazine. It's our quarterly magazine. We've got our next issue coming out in April. It is a feedback survey through SurveyMonkey, and I've just added the link to the chat box, so please check that out and leave us your thoughts so that we can continue building and nurturing our webinar offerings. I don't see any additional questions here, so I will do the official thank you on behalf of Green Teacher to Emily for delivering your practical ideas, your inspiration, and your energy with this fascinating topic that so many of us have had experience with and varying degrees of success. It certainly is evident that you've had a tremendous amount of success, and we really, really thank you for taking the time to present and share all of this with us this evening.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun to share this with folks. It's one of my favorite activities. And I'm adding into the chat box the Cable Natural History Museum's website, my Instagram handle, and my email address in case you have further questions for me, or if you want to tell me your successes as you test out this new technique.
That's great, and we will send all of this as a follow-up tomorrow in our email. Also, as of tomorrow, we will have the recording of this webinar up on our website, and it can be freely viewed by anybody, that's including subscribers and non-subscribers, for 30 days as of tomorrow. It appears that we have come very close to the bottom of the hour. I don't see any additional questions. Again, Emily, thank you so much for sharing all these wonderful ideas, and thank you to everybody who's joined in the discussion. In this line of work, the discussion never ends, and I'm sure we will cross paths either literally or figuratively or digitally at some point down the road. So thank you, Emily. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone.